We're reading EVERNIGHT by Ross Mackenzie. Tonight's chapter is called Old Hans. It's the 20th chapter. Ting-a-ling-a-ling! This was the voice of the bell on the door of Old Hans's shop. It was a cheerful sound, Laura thought, as she shook the afternoon drizzle from her clothes, and this was a cheerful place, a haven where toshers were welcome and made to feel like people worth the air they breathed. Dark and dusty and filled with curiosities and cobwebbed corners, Old Hans's shop was a treasure trove of artefacts from life in the slums. Everything from books and lamps to pet snakes and pistols, from taxidermy to bowls of doll's eyes. Lara approached the counter with a smile on her face because, for the first time in ages, she'd had a decent day's toshing. The stranger may have struck again in the night. The strangler may have struck again in the night, but what was Lara to do? Give up toshing and starve out of fear? The tunnels might seem darker than normal, the shadows threatening to come to life around every corner, but the sewers were Lara's territory, and she would not hand them over. Old Hans sat hunched behind his counter, as crooked and tatty as the crumbling shop around him. Currently, he was writing in a ledger, concentration etched in every wrinkle on his rubbery face. As the pen moved across the columns of numbers, Old Hans's tongue followed it, licking his lips from one side of his mouth and back again. Lara waited patiently, listening to the scratch of Old Hans's pen on the ledger, breathing the jumbled perfume of the shop, the dust and rotting wood, and the smell of other people's lives. At last Old Hans seemed satisfied. His tongue disappeared back into his thin mouth, and he placed his pen on the desk and closed the ledger. Because of his age, Old Hans always had the shakes. It affected his hands, and his head was always moving up and down in little nods like he was agreeing with the thoughts in his own head. "Lara Bell Fox, why, I haven't seen you in weeks." "Were you worried about me, Old Hans?" "Hard not to be worried about a young girl when there's a killer on the loose," he said. Then in a grandfatherly sort of tone he added, "You been careful, Lara Bell, looking after yourself?" Before she had a chance to answer, he held out a crooked finger. "You wait there." He stood up and shuffled through the door behind the counter to the back of the shop. A few minutes later he was back, and he placed a plate of bread and cheese on the counter. "Tuck in, girl. You look half-starved." Lara was so hungry she almost swallowed it with her eyes. She ripped off a hunk of bread and stuffed it in her mouth, followed by the creamy cheese. How wonderful it tasted. She cleared the plate in hardly any time at all, and when she was done, she licked the crumbs from the plate, and the last of the taste with her fingers. The warm, full feeling of food in her belly radiated through her, and she sighed happily. "Lady like you must have been famished, girl." "I've been going through a bit of a dry run. The sewers can be a right git when they want to." Old Hans nodded. "Happens to the best of 'em. But I assume, since you're here, that your dry run has come to an end, eh?" Lara smiled. Her dry run had indeed come to an end. She reached into her pocket, brought out a closed fist, and opened it over the counter, dropping a golden ring onto the scratched wood. She watched Old Hans, excitement fluttering in her chest. Well, what do we have here, eh?" He adjusted his glasses and reached under his counter, producing a brass magnifying glass. Then, with gnarled, shaking fingers, he picked up the ring. It took him a couple of attempts, and he held it in the palm of his hand and examined it closely. Hmm, said Lara. Said Old Hans. He put the brass spyglass down, popped the edge of the ring between his teeth and bit down. Then he returned it to the counter and leaned on his elbows. "Well?" Lara was full of nervous excitement. "It's pretty," said Old Hans. "But I'm sorry to tell you, Lara, that it isn't real gold. Nor is that sparkler a real diamond." Lara had been buoyant, for now she deflated a little. "You sure? It's heavy enough?" "Lara, I've been doing this for a long, long time. Believe me, Nothing wants to see you fishing a gold ring out of those sewers more than I do. It means more gold for both of us. But this isn't it. Not today." He gave her an appraising sort of look. "Of course you're more than welcome to go elsewhere for a second opinion. My old eyes are not what they used to be." Old Hans had kept this shop in Bone Alley for as long as anyone could remember. Parts of the slums had grown up around it. Every tosher had done business with him at some point, and nobody had a bad word to say about him, which was a rare thing among toshers, who spoke almost exclusively in bad words. Lady Light knew he'd helped Lara out of a scrape or two over the years. Even so, she'd been sure this ring was going to feed her for a while. Maybe it wouldn't do any harm to have someone else take a look, but this was Old Hans. "No," she said, trying to force a smile. "No, Old Hans. Whatever you say is fine by me. What can you give me for it?" He rubbed the silvery stubble of his old chin. "I reckon I'll shift it to some young fool in love who wants to impress his girl. I can't ask them more than a silver coin for it, so I'll give you half of that. 8 coppers. 10, said Lara. Old Hans screwed up his face. 9. Done. Ting-a-ling-ling. Old Hans watched the girl go out of sight, then came out from behind the counter and shuffled to the door and bolted and locked the many locks. After this, he went back behind the counter and reached for the ring that he'd just bought from Lara, and he made his way to the storeroom in the back. The storeroom was packed with shelving and boxes and crates. Half-repaired puppets hung from the ceiling on their strings, and the floor was hidden under piles of bicycle wheels, pots of paint, bird cages, and stacks of old damp newspapers. Old Hans went to a spot on the bare brick wall where the mortar was worn and crumbling. He wedged his old finger into a gap in the mortar and manoeuvred 3 bricks out of the wall, leaving a hole. Within was a safe. Old Hans smiled at the sight of it. He turned the dial on the safe this way and that until it unlocked with a click, and he pulled the door open and stared at what lay inside. Treasure. It paid to be in with the Toshers, paid to put up with their stench, and to greet them all with a "How do you do?" and a "Look after yourself in them sewers." And it was wise to give them a fair price for most of the loot they brought up from the tunnels, because if you did that, if you convinced them that you were good old Hans for long enough, then they'd trust you when they found something really valuable. And that's when the money was made. Inside the safe, Old Hans kept a large pile of fine jewellery. Tangled threads of silver and gold, brooches set with smooth precious stones, glimmering watches, strings of pearls. Every one of these pieces had come from a Tosher, and in each and every case the Tosher had no idea of the real value of what they were selling. Selling? Ha! More like giving away. Old Hans looked at the ring. Real gold it was, with a real gem to boot. A couple more pieces like this, and he'd finally have enough to retire, far away from the stink of the slums and the Toshers. He breathed on the ring, buffed the stone on his sleeve, and placed it on top of the pile of treasure in the safe. Then he locked the safe door, put the bricks back, and returned to the shop, smiling at his own cleverness.